Stream started. And we're live. Hey, Roman, welcome.
Thank you, Vasco. Thanks for having me. Nice to be
Yeah.
here.
Yeah, absolutely. So before people join in, and I thought it would be nice for us to just catch up and learn a little bit more about your latest project. So you have now, is it 3 books, one of which with 2 editions? Is that so?
Yes, I guess if you count my very
And we're
first book,
live.
4 in total,
Hey,
but
Roman,
yeah,
welcome.
yeah, certainly sort of when you look at the last, I don't know what, 12 or 13 odd years, it's 3 books. Yeah, and one of the books, Strategize, was published in its 2nd edition last September 22. Yes, yeah.
That's quite a lot of work. I know that writing books is not an easy project. How do you do it? Do you have like a special approach to writing books, or do you just close yourself in a room, let it flow? How does it happen for you?
Yeah, good question. So in the past, what I did is really block weeks in my calendar for book writing, which doesn't mean that all I do is work on the book, but it's really the main focus. I struggled to do this with how to lead in product management, particularly the 2nd edition of Strategize. So, you know, with the latter, I really kind of squeezed writing days into my schedule, which wasn't ideal. The good thing was that I didn't write the book from scratch. I reworked an existing book, and while I ended up rewriting part of the book, half of the book, about half of the book, which I didn't intend originally, you know, still I was working on existing material. That makes it easier. But yeah, so I block time in my calendar, really plan it in as a work task, as a work commitment, because otherwise I find, you know what it's like, you know, the important, not so urgent tasks, those are easily deprioritized and postponed, pushed out. And then, you know, it's also in terms of the focus and the energy that I require to do a good job writing. I just need to make some space for it, really. The other
Yeah.
thing that I've done with my books is I've used my blog to, I guess, create initial sections for the book, and to a certain extent test the waters, and to a certain extent experiment with ideas to see how people respond, what kind of comments people leave, if what I have to say is meaningful, is helpful, and if how I say it is beneficial for my audience. So that's been really helpful to sort of have a more incremental approach to creating a book, rather than sitting down with sort of, you know, metaphorically speaking, a blank piece of paper and it's like, oh dear, now I've got to write. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I do feel that at least when I write, I feel that there's like this special kind of like I would call it flow or mood, right? That I need to get into, and I've come to use this kind of a template, you could call it, like this beyond bullet points template for storytelling,
Mhm.
which is based on a very standard storytelling template that Hollywood uses, and that helps me kind of structure the ideas, kind of come up with the argument. Do you use something like that, like your own approach, or how do you come to the final blog post or chapters?
Yeah, so I don't really use a template, but I was making a mental note thinking, oh, I have to check this out. It sounds good. um, I mean, for me, the most important thing is in a way to get the overall book architecture right. So the contents, the table of contents, and really figure out what are the key topics that I want to address. What are the connections between those topics, and you know what's kind of the right sequence. Um, Sometimes that's more challenging, sometimes less. I did find it quite challenging with, you know, both of my last books, How to Lead in Product Management and Strategize. The original idea of Strategize was to kind of guide the reader through the journey of creating a book, and you know, then seeing how that book, how a strategy for a new product, how a strategy for a new product is created and validated, and then, you know, how the product is launched, and then and so forth. And I changed that, and then I changed the structure again for the 2nd edition.
So
We live and learn.
yeah, absolutely. Because you write about product, I'm curious to ask, do you look at your books as products and yourself as the product manager for that book?
Yeah, I do. I do. I mean, I try and practice what I preach as much as I can. And, you know, for me, looking at myself as a product person, as a product manager, product owner, whichever term you prefer, at least to a certain extent is helpful to keep my you know, in a way, my teachings real, you know, my training work real, and at the same time experiment with new ideas. So yes, yeah, I look at them as products.
Yeah, absolutely. That's also one of the things that I have started to kind of talk to clients about. Like, for example, if you're working with a startup, like the temptation is to go and write a whole new product, whatever, an app, a website, whatever that is, and then test it as such. And I've been trying to tell people that, hey, a very easy way to test if a product idea actually works in practice is to put it into a form of a book. Because if you can't sell the book for like €5, you're not going to sell the app for 20 either, right? So a book is actually a coherent construct to convey what might be a solution or a concept or the idea of a service. And if it has take-up rate, then you can definitely look into how software can make that 10 or 100 times better.
Yeah, sounds like an MVP.
And we did have Ash Maurya on the podcast, who, of course, wrote the book and then came up with the product. Right. So first it was a workshop. Then from the workshop he wrote the book, and then from the book he actually got the software for Lean Canvas and started selling that as well. So all of these things can be brought together.
Yeah.
So we're starting to see people streaming in. Hi, everybody. Welcome. We have people from England, Belgium, US, Pennsylvania, and Indiana. Hi, everybody. It's early morning in the US, so thanks for being with us. And thank you, everybody, for joining our keynote. We will be starting shortly, and you can send in your questions. So don't hesitate. Send the questions. I'll put them forward to Roman. But I guess now it's time to do the official start. So welcome, everybody. My name is Vasco, and I'm hosting this keynote, our first keynote of day 2 of the Product Owner Summit with our amazing speaker, Roman Pichler. Hey, Roman, welcome.
Thank you, Vasco. Lovely to be here.
Absolutely. It's great to have you here. Also, maybe this is your first keynote with your new look, right?
The new look. Yeah, it might be.
So that's an honor for us, of course. Roman is a keynote speaker, trainer, and author of some seminal books on the topic of product management in Agile. Some of his latest books are How to Lead in Product Management, and also the second version of his book, Strategize for Product Managers. So check those out. Also, if you're interested in this topic, of course, here at the Summit, we have loads of other talks. So do check all of those at productownersummit.org. But now let's start with Roman's thoughts, ideas, insights, and of course, tips and tricks for all of us. And we're going to start with the critical PO responsibilities, authorities, or as the Scrum Guide calls it, accountability. So early in the Scrum adoption cycle, we heard phrases such as the PO is the CEO of the product, the single ringable net, the only person that can make decisions on the product. Of course, as we learned more about Agile and how it works, we saw that that was perhaps a bit too extreme perspective on the role. And the reality is that we are using Scrum in context where these phrases don't even remotely apply. And of course, that leads to a lot of confusion on the product owner role. So let's start there, Roman. In your mind, what are the primary responsibilities and authorities that come with this product owner role?
Yeah, I think it's a very important question, and I've always liked the suggestion that I think the Scrum framework and the Scrum Guide have now made for quite a few years, and that is that the product owner's responsibility is to maximize the value of the product that the individual looks after, that the individual manages, or, you know, metaphorically speaking, owns on behalf of the company. So it's not about writing user stories. It's not primarily about managing the product backlog, prioritizing the product backlog, or pleasing the stakeholders. It's about maximizing the value. And value for me has 2 elements. one element is the value that users and possibly customers perceive. So the need that the product addresses for a group of people, users, and as I said, possibly customers, a specific problem that the product solves or a specific benefit that it offers. And then value for the business, a specific business goal or several specific business goals that the product achieves. And that might be to generate revenue, achieve a certain profit target, develop the brand, reduce cost, increase productivity, reduce time to market for other products. If you think of an internal supporting product like, say, a software platform. But yeah, I mean, those are the two elements. And so for me, then it's very important that a product owner is able to say, this is the value my product should create, and understand what does it mean in the context of my product. And if that's the responsibility of a product owner, a product person in an agile Scrum-based context to make sure that the product creates as much value as possible, then for me, the authority has to be that the individual is empowered not only to make tactical product decisions, product delivery oriented decisions around the product backlog, but also make strategic decisions and has what I like to call full stack ownership. So, owns not only the tactical delivery related aspects of the product, but again, owns the strategic aspects. And so that means being able to determine the value proposition of the product, being able to determine the right market segment, and being authorized to do that, being authorized to have the final say in making those decisions, determining standout features, determining, again, business goals, and deriving a product roadmap. So for me, that's super important. And I find that sometimes forgotten. And the name product owner for me provides an important clue. I said earlier, own a product on behalf of the company. It's sort of a figure of speech, like a metaphor, really, that that Scrum uses. But I think it's an important one. I mean, in an agile context, we know that collaboration is valued, and that a number of people have to work together to achieve success. And so it's the product owner and the development team or developers, depending on which term you prefer, the Scrum Master, but they're also the stakeholders, and we need to collect feedback from users and customers, early and frequently. So all these people ultimately have to work together to create value. But if you now think about a sprint review meeting and you think about one or two development teams and the Scrum Master and the stakeholders and possibly selected users and customers, it's quite a crowd. And not only is it quite a few people, but it's also quite a diverse group of people. And so if no agreement can be achieved, then there has to be a person, the Scrum framework suggests, and I would generally speaking agree, who can make a decision and move the process forward and say, like, well, if we can't agree, then let's run another sprint, let's run another experiment, and hopefully then we have the relevant data to see clearer and be able to make that decision. And that person, who then has the final say and is empowered or should be empowered to make a decision, is the product owner. But I think that empowerment aspect, that sort of authority, and in a way that respect that a product owner requires, that's often kind of lost or forgotten about, unfortunately.
And when it comes to prioritization of the backlog, that responsibility becomes very clear, very concrete, very practical on a sprint by sprint basis. And one of the aspects of the product ownership role, of course, is to collect feedback from stakeholders, but also from the market, right? And from the development team. How do you advise the product owners you work with to take that into consideration? Because it's very easy to, when we say product owner, it's very easy to say, no, I just make the decision. Well, making the decision is an incredibly valuable skill, but of course, decisions can't be made in a vacuum. So how do you advise product owners to kind of consider this wider community that contributes to the actual prioritization?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's a general challenge in product management. And what we talked about in terms of empowerment is not only a product owner issue, it's not only an agile issue, it's a general issue in product management. And again, what you just touched upon, as I said, it's also a general challenge. As product people, we have to ensure that we spend enough time on product delivery, progressing a specific product, creating new features, enhancing existing features, working with development teams, and getting those enhancements, new features delivered. But if that's all we do, then we, take the risk that we overlook important market developments, important trends. And an example I like to use is cycling, maybe because I enjoy cycling in my spare time. When you cycle, the same is true when you walk. There's sort of, in a way, a work stream, I could maybe say, you engage in that's very much focused on execution and delivery. So with cycling, it's keeping the balance, it's changing the gears, it's pushing the cranks. And so professional cyclists, I've learned, spend a lot of time optimizing their pedal stroke, pedaling as smoothly and as efficiently as possible. But if that's all you do, all you do is focus on execution, delivery, pushing the pedals, and you don't look ahead enough, you'll crash sooner or later. You'll crash into an obstacle, you miss a corner, a bend, and it's going to be painful. And the same is true for product people, and the same is true in product management. So, as product owners, we have to learn to balance the attention to the right here, right now, the product delivery, and the looking ahead, the strategic work or the discovery work, whichever term you prefer. And so the making time, to do, in a way, some continued strategizing and some continuous discovery, and seeing what are the market trends, what are competitors doing, what technology trends are emerging, maybe what regulatory trends, assuming that's important for my product, generally consumer trends, what's out there, what is the product performance like, using the right metrics and KPIs. Those are important tasks in my mind for product owners in Scrum, and it's something that really has to be planned in, something that shouldn't be like, oh dear, that's also something I need to do. Ooh, well, when am I going to do this? Oh, well, if I've got time, if I've written all those user stories and I've done, I've talked to all these stakeholders and I've done all these important prioritization decisions. It's like, no, you really have to plan this in, and you really have to budget for it, and it should be a firm part of your work. And the recommendation I like to give to people is spend at least half a day per week on those strategy, discovery oriented tasks, at least. And again, put the time in your calendar, ring fence that time, don't sacrifice it, because otherwise, in the worst case, you're being caught out, you're being leapfrogged by a competitor, and then you struggle to catch up, and that'd be a shame.
Yeah, absolutely. I really like that how do you say that concrete focus on collecting feedback from the market, whether it is evaluating competitors or reading market reports, going to some conferences or summits like this one, and learning from that future-looking work, which you also call strategizing, is incredibly important. Also because when we think about the role of prioritization, right, the accountability or authority for prioritization, it has to be influenced by that kind of information. And of course, that's a critical aspect. So understanding the future, understanding the market to make prioritization decisions. How about collecting that also from stakeholders? Like, what's your advice in how to integrate the stakeholder input? Maybe it's internal stakeholders. Maybe that's the majority that we have. Maybe it's also other teams. Like, how do you advise product owners to take that into account?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'd just like to, if that's okay, very briefly touch on the prioritization point and kind of just strengthen what you said. So I think it's very difficult to make the right prioritization decisions in the product backlog if you're not aware of the bigger picture, if you don't have something like a product strategy and product roadmap in place. And I know we'll talk about this probably a little bit later in more detail, but I just wanted to point that out. The other thing that I find super helpful to get the prioritization and the product backlog right is to work with a product goal, which is something Scrum, at least the Scrum Guide, introduced in its current version. And I think having a specific outcome, a specific achievable outcome, a specific product goal, maybe for the next few months, it can be super helpful to determine how urgent is a product backlog item, how soon should a user story or piece of functionality be done, and maybe should we do it at all? So if something doesn't, if a request isn't helpful to reach and meet a product goal, it shouldn't be in the product backlog. So yeah, super helpful. I find product goals can be. Stakeholders, that's an interesting one. So with stakeholders, I think that the two key recommendations I'd like to make. The first one is to do a little bit of stakeholder analysis, particularly for those of you who work in large organizations, and think about who are my key stakeholders, those stakeholders that I really want to build good working relationships with, where I want to build some trust, and people I want to kind of pull into the development process and generally involve in key product decisions. And one way to do this stakeholder analysis is to use the power interest grid, which is a tool that was developed by two individuals called Ackerman and Eden, and published in a book called Making Strategy a few years back. And that essentially encourages us to group stakeholders into 4 groups, depending on how much influence, power they have, and how interested they are in our product. And those that have a lot of influence, have a lot of power, and are interested in our product, those are the key stakeholders or players. So that's the first step, because otherwise, potentially you've got like, a group of 20, 30 or more stakeholders, and you can't involve everyone. I think in a meaningful way, and you can't build relationships with all those individuals. I think it just becomes overwhelming, becomes too much. And then once you figured out the key stakeholders, my recommendation is to involve those individuals early and frequently. From a Scrum perspective, there's the Scrum team, and that's always been I think a very important concept in Scrum. So I encourage close collaboration between the person in charge of the product owner, and a team, or a cross-functional, self-managing, self-organizing team of people who design, develop, and test and document the product. So the development team or the developers, and then we've got the Scrum Master in the mix. But that's not quite enough. And so I think you need to, in a way, extend that team with the key stakeholders. And I've suggested to form a stakeholder community or create what I would then refer to as a product team that essentially is that extension, that is the Scrum team plus the key stakeholders. And the idea is, A, as I said, to involve important key stakeholders early and frequently, and B, really to get to know those individuals and build trust. And that really helps with making effective product decisions, and it reduces the risk that individuals push for their own selfish interests or the interests of their group, their department. But ultimately, really, the goal should be to make decisions together in the best interest of the product and the best interest of the users and customers and the business as a whole.
So I wanted to pick up on that, because I think that's a great tip for us to take in as product owners. This idea, you called it the product team, right? And when we go back to the origin of Scrum, where one of the phrases used is the product owner is the CEO of the product, all CEOs have an advisory board, right? And what you just discussed is indeed something similar to an advisory board. And you don't bring all of the shareholders into the advisory board. There's specific type of people, and of course specific type of influence you need in order to be able to be in that advisory board. So is that what you mean, like a little bit like a product advisory board that we can work to create?
Yeah, I think I'd sort of take this a little bit further than saying, those are people that advise. That's the least level of involvement that personally I'd like to see, so that, product owner consults the key stakeholders. But I think as the person in charge of the product, we don't always have the relevant knowledge to make all the right decisions. And so we, to a certain extent, rely on the expertise of the stakeholders and the development team members. So I think from that perspective alone, maximizing our chances to make the best possible decisions, it's useful to involve people and listen to what they have to say, listen to their suggestions, ideas, and concerns, and again, leverage their knowledge. But then the second thing is it creates really a clear and hopefully a shared understanding of the goals that we agree upon, the strategic goals and the maybe more tactical goals that we select. And that creates a strong alignment. And then thirdly, I find when you involve people in making a decision and you attentively listen to people, then people are more likely to support you, are more likely to see through the decision, implement the decision, even if not all of their ideas could be taken on board. So for me, those are 3 good reasons why it's useful to really involve development team members and stakeholders in important product decisions, without without making the mistake of trying to please everyone, and then agreeing on a weak compromise that be then designed by committee. And I think it doesn't the first Scrum book say something like the product owner is a single person, not a committee. And so wouldn't be a good idea to try and broker a compromise and try and please everyone. And it wouldn't be a good idea to allow the most senior person in the room to dominate, or individual stakeholders to take over and say like, okay, great, we now decide.
Which also highlights the importance of us having facilitation tools and being able to create a positive and converging conversation within that group of stakeholders.
Absolutely. And, for me, I'd see the Scrum Master or Agile coach or another skilled facilitator as an individual who helps with that, who does the facilitation so that product owners, product people can contribute to the conversation and help make the right decisions. I think it's very challenging. It can be very challenging, particularly if it's a newish group or if the level of trust isn't particularly strong, if people aren't used to work together. To do both, contribute and facilitate at the same time. I think that, again, that can be very challenging. So my recommendation generally is use a dedicated facilitator like the Scrum Master to help prepare collaborative sessions, and then maybe establish ground rules, remind people of those ground rules. So, sometimes you get people that are very quiet and kind of find it hard to make a contribution. And you get people like me, they never shut up. Like, oh my God,
we're
he's going on and on about
course.
this. So yeah, then it's good to have a Scrum Master, Agile coach who facilitates.
Absolutely. So GT asks, since we are on the topic of ownership, product ownership, do you feel like the owner part of the role has been diluted, especially in large organizations? How can we change that?
Yeah, I think it's not always. I think generally the product owner role particularly is not always correctly understood, and I'd argue that it's often the case in product management. When you step outside of the Scrum bubble, the Scrum world, or even the Agile space, that product roles, that the product contributors, the product managers, the practicing product people aren't always as empowered. They don't always have the necessary decision-making authority, and I think it's rather common in my experience, I have to say. Now, how can we strengthen the authority of a product owner? For me, there are two factors at play. One is, the expertise of the individual, and in a way that the soft skills of the individual, so the hard and the soft skills. So it's very difficult to trust somebody and follow somebody's advice if you think the person doesn't really understand what they're talking about. To put it differently, so if I'm the product owner and I don't really know much about my product, I don't really know much about the market, I don't really understand the user needs in depth, I don't really have much knowledge about how the organization works, it'll be hard for people to say like, oh yeah, we'll trust Roman's advice, we'll just go with what Roman has to say. Yeah, sure. They'll probably say the opposite. They're like, no way. And then the second element is, if I'm not a if I'm not a trustworthy person, if I don't speak and act with integrity, if people don't really believe that I act in their best interest, or certainly I wouldn't do anything to cause them a disadvantage or harm them, if I don't really follow through my commitments, I'm not a reliable person. I'm not really. I don't really feel accountable for things I've said I'd do. Then again, it'll be hard for people to trust me. So
what you're saying is that our own attitude as a product owner may dilute or support the ownership part of the role.
Absolutely. And so, for me, it's an important recognition, because that means there's something I can do, something that I can work on my hard skills, and maybe I lack some strategy related skills. I mean, maybe just to use a specific example, a few years back, I met someone who said to me, I wish my management would empower me to own the product roadmap and make the road mapping decisions. And so, we had a conversation, and and during that conversation, I asked the individual, so you've created a product roadmap, right? Or you know how to do this? And the person looked at me somewhat surprised and said like, well, no, why? And I said, then, well, it's a difficult one, but I mean, sure, it'd be nice for your management to encourage you and, ask you to create a product roadmap. At the same time, if you've never done it, it's kind of hard for management to trust you. So in that case, maybe the easiest way forward is to acquire the necessary knowledge about what a product roadmap is and how I can create a modern product roadmap that fits well in an agile context, and maybe even go ahead and create one and show it to management and thereby prove I can do it. And so that's again something where I can work straight away on my own skills. The other element, the second element, is the organizational context. It's the environment. If an organization is in the process of moving from a more project-driven environment to more a product-focused, product-oriented, product-led way of working, if there is no product management organization, if there's no head of product, or if the product management maturity is very low, then working as a product owner will be significantly more challenging. It's the way it is. And you'll find again and again that stakeholders don't quite understand what level of empowerment you require, and maybe treat you more like a project manager or a personal assistant rather than somebody who owns the product on behalf of the company and should have the final say on even important product decisions. In that situation, I think you just require a little bit of patience and perseverance. And at the same time, I would recommend trying to influence the decision makers in the organization and lobby for more support, for more senior management, executive management support.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we think about the role of the product owner and of course our own, I would say, self-development in that area, like what would you recommend, right? Because what you're discussing, the hard and the soft skills, some of those I'm sure you have in your book, Agile Product Management with Scrum as well. But where could we go to learn what are those skills and how to develop those hard and soft skills that are so critical for the product owner?
Well, sounds like an opportunity to plug my own work. I mean, I generally like to think about, when it comes to skills, product management skills, when it comes to product owner related skills, about, first of all, using the T-shaped model and sort of, making sure that as the person in charge of the product, enough about a specific product, its domain, its market, maybe roughly the type of technologies that are used to build the product, and then that you have enough kind of broad product management knowledge, methods-based knowledge, you could say, that you know what a product vision is, what a product strategy is, what a product roadmap is, how you can prioritize a product backlog, those kind of things. And then those general product management skills I like to break down into three sets. One are the more tactical product delivery oriented skills around, say, the product backlog and making detailed product decisions. And then strategic skills, as the name says, around making the right strategic discovery oriented decisions. And then people related skills, or I call them leadership skills, because I really do feel that individual product people, product contributors also have to offer some leadership, and align stakeholders and development teams in order to achieve shared goals, move the product forward, and create value together. And I think it's always helpful to step back and reflect on what are my strengths, and maybe where do I know I've got some weaknesses or opportunities to improve in my skill set, but also think about, where do I want to go, and what is maybe the job role I'd like to move into, and what kind of skills would be required then to be successful in that role, and thereby, what are the skills that I'd like to develop over, say, the coming 12 months or so, and then create a learning plan that states some clear learning goals, and identify some clear learning measures in order to develop and grow as a professional, as a product professional.
Absolutely. So you did not plug your work, but I will. Agile Product Management with Scrum by Roman Pichler. Be sure to, especially if you're new to the whole idea of product management in a Scrum context, to get that book and read it attentively. But I think now it's a good time to actually start and going towards what you call the tactical and strategic skills of product managers and product owners. What are some of the approaches and effective practices you've seen work really well for product road mapping in an agile context, and how do they differ from a more traditional environment, if you will?
Yeah, great question. And I mean, maybe some people watching will feel slightly uneasy by, mentioning product roadmaps in Agile in one sentence. It's like, oh my God. I mean, I've certainly had more than one person say to me, Agile product roadmaps in an Agile context, Agile product roadmaps, that's impossible, right? And I think the reason for that is you kind of alluded to it is the traditional product road mapping approach, which tends to be thinking about a list of features and product capabilities, and then mapping those features, those larger pieces of functionality onto a timeline. So that's pretty much how you create a traditional product roadmap. And such a product roadmap is based on features. It's very much output and delivery focused. So we think about the solution and we say which aspects of the solution will need to be enhanced and will need to be provided over the coming 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12 months. Now, in an agile context, obviously, development teams, certainly in Scrum, only commit for the next few weeks, for the next sprint. And so we want to actually leverage an element of uncertainty, and we want to delay decisions to the last responsible moment and not solutionize at a very early stage. If we could do that, we wouldn't have to inspect and adapt. We wouldn't have to iterate. We wouldn't have to use a process like Scrum. And so a traditional feature-based roadmap doesn't really fit. And for me, the solution is to then not use features as the primary element of a agile product roadmap, but use goals or outcomes. So the benefits that we want to achieve with our product, the value that we want to create with our product over the coming maybe 6 to 12 months. And that might be to acquire new users. It might be to increase engagement. It might be to reduce cost. It might be to generate a certain amount of revenue, or it might be to reduce technical debt in order to future-proof the product. But these goals, they should be specific enough so that we can measure if we've attained them, if we've met those goals. And I like to suggest to work with goals that typically cover a time frame of 2 to 3 months on a product roadmap. I find that those goals tend to work quite well for the stakeholders and the development teams to create alignment and give teams enough time to just to work towards those goals and actually create a meaningful amount of software, of functionality.
And it also helps us not to solutionize too early, right? Because if the goal covers 2 to 3 months, we are not trying to make it so concrete that we need to know what to do tomorrow.
Yeah, thank you, Vasco. That's absolutely right. Yeah, I mean, for me, it doesn't mean that you can't use features, selected coarse-grained, high-level features on a product roadmap. And I mean, those of you that are familiar with the roadmap template that I've developed will know that I do suggest including selected features on a product roadmap, but with any goal-oriented, outcome-based roadmap, the goals, the outcomes, the benefits, those are the primary elements, and they come first. And then any features you put on such a roadmap have to be dependent on those goals, and any feature must serve a specific goal. So you can't just squeeze a feature on a goal-oriented, outcome-based roadmap. You have to find a goal or an outcome that this feature supports. If the goal doesn't exist, you either have to amend the roadmap or you have to decline the feature. And the other thing I'd like to say is any features on a goal-oriented roadmap should be very big and coarse-grained, very sketchy, and only 3 to 5 features per goal as a rule of thumb, with a preference on the smaller number. So yeah, the goal really has to be the dominant element.
So Fred asks a question related to your product management framework, and let's stick with the roadmap aspect of that framework for a bit. What are some of the practices that you mention in your framework that you think we should start with as we transition more towards that goal-centric or goal-based roadmap?
Yeah, great question. It depends a little bit where you're at the moment. Sometimes I find when you are new to working with goals and outcomes, and you're currently very output focused, very much focused around deliver this feature for me, implement this piece of functionality for me. If that's the current situation you're in, then I'd say just establish a single goal, a single outcome for the next 3 months. Make sure that that outcome is agreed upon with the key stakeholders, the development team members, and whoever acts as the senior management sponsor, and that people clearly understand that goal is specific enough and that it's measurable, and then do everything you can to work towards that goal. And that's just really to get to people to understand what are goals, what are outcomes, and to offer an opportunity to try it out. And once you've achieved this, then take the next step and say, okay, now let's identify not only a single goal for the next 2 to 3 months, but for the next maybe 9 to 12 months. And then let's put those goals on a product roadmap and prioritize them and sequence them in a meaningful way. But I wouldn't necessarily start with a big goal-oriented roadmap if, again, your organization really isn't used to working in a goal-oriented manner and working with outcomes, and again has a very strong solution focus, a very strong delivery, a very strong feature focus.
How do you fit the concept of vision into the framework? How do those two come together?
Yeah, nice question. And it's an interesting one. I mean, I find the two dominant, I guess, notions or concepts of ideas, what a vision is. And I've changed my mind over the years on this. So for me, these days, a vision is just a big inspirational goal and an aspiration that we have with our product, or to put it differently, the positive change we'd like to bring about, the ultimate reason why our product exists. And so for me, an effective product vision is big, it's enduring, it lasts, provides continued guidance for the next 5 to 10 years. It's hopefully big enough so that people can buy into it and support it, so it's shared. It should be inspiring and somewhat motivating to create a forward momentum, a pull, but there is no detailed information. More detailed information I would then capture in a product strategy. But there are other people out there who like to use a template such as Jeffrey Moore's vision template that essentially combines what I would call a product strategy and a vision. The reason that I like to keep the vision at a very high level and then the strategy separate, at least to a certain extent, is so that you can change your strategy but stay grounded in your vision, so you can pivot, to use a lean startup term. And I think that can be very, very useful and very powerful. So yeah, for me, the vision is just a big overarching goal, something like healthy eating, if that's an example I like to use. If I wanted to develop a product that helps people understand what they eat and how much they eat, then yeah, healthy eating or help people eat more healthily might be a great vision statement.
So staying in that vein of considering the, let's say, larger aspects of the product management, product ownership role, we have a question from Francesco. What do you think? What are the biggest changes for product owners when it comes to managing software products versus hardware or service-related products?
Yeah, great question. So I tend to focus on the digital space. I mean, with hardware, you typically use, so I think, I've got limited experience working with hardware products, but based on the limited experience I have, I'd say, first of all, the timescales and the ability to experiment and iterate rapidly is different, simply because of the technologies that you have in order to develop a hardware-based or hardware-centric product. And then if there's hardware, software, and maybe firmware, and possibly plastics as well, that everything needs to come together to create a product, then you have often different teams that are specialized in, say, creating the software, creating the hardware, creating the firmware, and then creating the plastics. And those teams need to be coordinated, so the coordination effort is higher, and the development effort or the group of people required in order to bring a new product to life or progress a product is just larger. So scaling can be more challenging. Yes, did I answer the question?
I think definitely one aspect like the time frames and the ability to experiment will definitely affect that role. So I think those are already quite obvious concrete differences between these two. And I imagine that in your mind also that affects how we put together the roadmap, what kind of time frames affect the roadmap and so on.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks for mentioning the roadmap. So, I mean, I've done some work with, you know, companies developing hardware-based products or a combination of software and hardware, and often, so when it comes to digital products, I tend to say, 12 months is probably a good time frame for a product roadmap. Again, for a digital product, but for hardware-based products, often you need to extend it to 24 months and beyond, which also means that what I said about goals, that they have to be specific and measurable. Once you go beyond 12 months, it can be difficult to have those specific measurable quarterly goals or bi-monthly goals, and then you have to be willing to accept that your roadmap just gets a little bit more vague, because otherwise you pretend to know when you don't, and I don't think that's generally speaking beneficial. So yeah, bigger, longer product roadmaps and roadmaps that just contain a little bit more uncertainty and goals that are a little bit bigger and vaguer.
So I wanted to keep on the planning aspect, and I want to dive into the agile strand of the planning thoughts that you might have. In an agile context, the idea is that planning is accessory. It helps, but it's not final. And when we plan, we do that because we have a structure, a starting point from which to start the adapting process, for example, by incorporating customer feedback. So, what's your advice when it comes to incorporating customer feedback as well as experiments and put that into how we do the planning, right? At the end of the day, how do we implement the core value of Agile responding to change in our product owner practices?
Yeah, I think it's a very important question. And for me, it helps, at least on a conceptual level, to distinguish between strategic planning and then more tactical delivery focused planning. So, a framework like Scrum offers what I find are solid practices for dealing with the more delivery oriented, tactical, short-term planning. You think about sprint planning, you think about then having sprint review meetings and sprint retrospectives in order to inspect and then adapt the product, the sprint review meeting, and then to inspect and adapt the process, the retrospective meeting. But, I think those meetings need to be complemented by a inspect and adapt process on the strategic level. So, to make this very simple and concrete, I like to suggest, as a rule of thumb, to have quarterly product strategy review meetings where the product strategy and the product roadmap are being inspected collaboratively by the key stakeholders and the development team members or representatives from different development teams, together with the overall product owner, the person in charge of the product. And then, if necessary, any adaptations, any changes are made to those plans, to the product roadmap and the product strategy. So it'd be a big mistake to assume that we've once created a strategy, that's it, and then we've derived a product roadmap, and then that's it, and then all we need to do for the next 12 to 18 months is execute and deliver. I mean, we all know the world doesn't stand still, and unforeseen things do happen. And so it's important to just be proactive and leverage opportunities at an early stage and counter threats again early on. So we're not surprised, we're not being caught out, and we're not then in a situation where we struggle, where we find ourselves with our backs against the wall. And for me, that's the whole purpose of planning. Planning is to look ahead, to have options, and again be responsive, not be reactive, not be caught out. It doesn't mean that we get our plans right, and it doesn't mean that we don't have to replan. And so I think that's a very important notion. Essentially, do what we're doing on the tactical level, inspect and adapt every few weeks. Do the same thing on a strategic level, but not necessarily every few weeks, but every few months, or as I said, every 3 months as a rule of thumb.
So we're almost at the end, but I did want to ask this question because I think it's something that our viewers are for sure waiting for. It's been a topic here on the summit several times, and it's even the core aspect of one of our tracks, which is this being data-driven in our product ownership decision making. So give us some examples that you might even have used in your book where you talked about this data-driven decision making. Give us some examples of where that is working well as where we might want to get started implementing that data-driven mantra that can be so helpful if we know how to do it.
Yeah, sure. I mean, personally, I prefer the term data informed, but I mean, I think the idea is the same, to use data, use empirical evidence to make our decisions and not just gut feeling and past experience. And again, you know, sometimes the right first step is to make database detailed product decisions as Scrum suggests, and that's what Scrum supports. So, you know, in the sprint review meeting, for instance, collect feedback from stakeholders and possibly selected users and customers by using a product demo, doing a product demo, and then, you know, analyze that feedback and learn from it and adapt the product backlog and consequently adapt the product accordingly. Now, on a strategic level, you can use empirical evidence, you can use data and feedback in various ways. A very important way is by determining helpful metrics and KPIs, key performance indicators for your products, and then regularly collecting and evaluating that data. And which KPIs, which metrics you should use will depend on the specific value that your product should create. And that should be described in your product strategy, and it should be described in your product roadmap. So look at the product goals, look at the goals on your product roadmap, look at the needs stated in your strategy together with the business goals in your strategy. And that should give you an idea which KPIs to use. But, you know, just to make this a little bit more concrete, common KPIs are things like engagement, customer satisfaction, and for revenue generating products, obviously revenue. But you might also use some what I call health indicators, such as quality indicators. The code complexity or refactoring potential can be worthwhile to keep an eye on for your products. So yeah, use those KPIs to measure the value your product is creating and see how healthy your product is, and if you know, the strategy is still working. Because if you find that there's a negative trend around engagement, there's a negative trend around revenue, there's a negative trend around sign-up rates, then, you know, something's wrong, and chances are that your current strategy isn't working. So it would be then a mistake just to, you know, continue delivering, and, you know, sort of, you know, look at it as business as usual. You should probably stop and pause and reflect and think about, okay, what needs to happen, and do we need to adapt our strategy and make some bigger changes, possibly even, you know, stop the current development effort and pivot. You know.
And actually, you pointed to something that is very important from this data-driven, or as you call it, data-informed approach, which is that data helps us ask better questions. We can't know if the strategy is wrong if our key metric of success is the amount of features we've delivered last quarter, right? But if we look at some of the metrics you've mentioned, there is a possibility that we will figure out that, hey, something is not working well. Why is that? And then, you know, start that Sherlock Holmes style process of figuring out what's the actual problem. And then that may lead to strategy, or it may lead to something else. It doesn't matter, but it helps us ask better questions. Now, I know that we've asked a similar question before, but Diogo and Jones mentioned a question that I think it's good to just kind of, as we've discussed so many things already today, maybe come back to that concept of how do we get everybody on the same page? So Diogo asks about, you know, stakeholders that want everything at the same time, and Jones talks about working laterally as maybe a consultant that is there to do a little bit of product owner role, but then somebody else is deciding within the company to make those decisions. I think this calls up to the aspects and processes of decision making. And we've talked a little bit about it already, but what are like 1, 2, 3 key practices you think product owners should be aware of to foster this collaborative but also effective and assertive decision making in their organizations?
Yeah, I think you put it quite nicely. It's that combination, right? Saying, you know, as the product owner, I I need to assume a certain decision-making authority. And quite honestly, it's not right to ask somebody to be a product owner, be a product manager, or play, another product role, and be responsible for the value a product creates, but not empowering the person, not giving the person the necessary decision-making authority. It's not fair. It's not right. And so, you know, sometimes I have to advise individuals to say, like, look, the situation you're in, yes, you can try and build relationships with the stakeholders and with the CEO and with the development team members, but if you have a bunch of pushy stakeholders and your CEO is not supportive and says, like, what's your problem, just get on and do what they tell you to do, you're not a product manager, you're not a product owner, you're not a product person. They're treating you like a PA. Any good project manager would reject working in an environment like you're in for an extended period of time. So you really need to think about if the situation you're in is healthy and what your chances are to bring about a positive change. I'm just saying this because, I don't want to create the impression that by being nice to people and listening attentively and empathizing with people and building trust, everything will work out fine. It might, or it might not. But yeah, I mean, certainly if you are in a difficult situation, that's where I'd start. I'd start with trying to understand, why do people behave in certain ways, and how what are their goals, what are their underlying needs, and how can I work with those individuals, how can I build trust, how can I help them understand the situation that I'm in. But if you have stakeholders that come to you and demand features, I do think you should tell those individuals in the right way, in a way that they can receive that is not okay. That you very much appreciate their initiative, and you very much appreciate their thoughts and the effort to come to you and make that request, but that you're not there just to fulfill people's requests and say yes, 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 and oh yeah, sure, we'll deliver this in 2 weeks time, no problem, thank you, madam, thank you, sir. That's not the job of a product owner, that's not the job of a product person.
And I think that's where an Agile coach and Scrum Master can be a great partner in that conversation. So get together and work together on that for sure. So we're getting close to the end, Roman, but before we go, Linz also asks the question, that would be my next question. What is one resource? Could be a video, a podcast, a blog, a book, or even several books about the topic that we've discussed today. So the responsibilities and authorities of the product owner, as well as agile planning for product owners. What would be good books for us to read?
Yeah, so I'm now extremely tempted to plug my own book. So in terms of the strategy and roadmap related aspects, you might want to take a look at my book Strategize, which discusses those practices in hopefully a fair amount of detail, sufficient detail, but also kind of offers a holistic approach. So it's not just a bunch of practices or a bunch of templates that I offer, but I've made an effort to connect individual practices and templates and tools so that there is a cohesive approach that you get, that the different techniques that I described, the different methods, that they really fit together. So that's what I suggest you consider looking at. And in terms of the roles and responsibilities and also trust building, you may want to take a look at my book, How to Lead in Product Management, where I discuss the product role and I discuss trust building measures. I talk about empowerment. I talk about collaborative decision-making techniques, and using, for instance, specific decision rules such as consent and unanimous agreements that can be really super helpful to make sure that everybody's on the same page and everybody understands who makes a decision and when a decision is actually made.
Yeah, absolutely. So, of course, we want to thank you, Roman, for being here and sharing all your knowledge and experience with our community. If people want to reach out and learn more about what you're doing, the work that you're doing, and contact you, where should they go?
Yeah, the best place to go is to my website, romanpichler.com. Again, you'll find links to the books that I've mentioned. You find quite a few articles, both in terms of the product role, soft skills, leadership skills, and strategy and road mapping. You find videos on there, or links to videos at least on there. You find my podcast on there, and also the services, the training courses that I provide. So yeah, check it out. Yeah, hopefully you'll find the material useful that I offer.
Absolutely. We'll put the link on the notes below the video, so go there and check it out so that you can get in touch. Roman, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for your generosity with your time and your knowledge. Do you have for us one last wise word before we leave you?
Yeah, so first of all, I'd like to say it was really nice to talk to you. It's really nice to be here and make a contribution to the event. And I really appreciate people asking questions. So thank you for having me. Final word of wisdom: being an effective product person, being an effective product professional, being an effective product owner is not easy. I find it can be super rewarding. It can be very exciting to create value for users and the business, and bring a product to life and progress a product. I think it can be a privilege doing that, but it can also be very stressful and very challenging. So acknowledge that, and don't put yourself under undue pressure. Don't expect that, for instance, you can use a goal-oriented outcome-based roadmap or introduce a goal-oriented outcome-based roadmap super quickly and everybody will be super excited. So take your time, and sometimes you just have to be patient and show a bit of perseverance, and be happy with small incremental successes that you can build on. So yeah,
Absolutely, the
have
core of
have some
Agile, right?
have some
Incrementally.
self-compassion.
Yes, incrementally get better. Thank you, Roma. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, likewise.